Um, Thanks very much for having us here today. We are going to be talking about wild pine in the Highlands. I'm going to be talking about the state of what we know about our current pine woods. And then I'm going to pass on to my colleague Gian, who's going to talk about some of the woodlands that we don't know very much about, the wild pine sites that have went under the radar. And she's doing a project to start to document these areas. So yeah, just to start off, we're both from Trees for Life. Trees for Life has mainly been a tree planting focused charity that was kind of brought up in the Highlands. We are starting to shift our focus towards wild populations of trees in the landscape, natural regeneration, landscape scale working. And the project that I worked on for 4 years was called the Caledonian Pinewood Recovery Project. And it was a project to basically go out to all of our Caledonian pinewoods across the Highlands and survey them and establish how they're doing in terms of their health and resilience. So first of all, I just thought I'd start with talking about what actually wild pine means. So in a room full of botanists, this is probably not kind of new information, but for a lot of tree people who've come through kind of a forestry world, they don't necessarily think of trees as wildlife or as wild populations. So whenever we're thinking about wild pine, we're thinking about the populations that recolonized Scotland after the last ice age. We know that there were a couple of populations that recolonized. We think one came from the west and one from the south. And we know that pine has been in the Highlands for at least 9,900 years. And so some of these populations are really, really old. And they are generated through natural regeneration or colonization. So no one has planted these trees at any point. They've just done what trees do whenever they're in natural populations forever. And because of that, they have variable density and form. So they're not like trees that you see in kind of high forests, which are all very uniform. A lot of the pine woods in our Cali pine woods, you can see just how variable they are, these trees. Whenever I first came to Scotland, I thought they looked more like oaks, the whole that kind of branching pattern. They have this really long genetic and ecological continuity that goes right back to shortly after the last ice age, and really high genetic diversity as well in these wild populations. And because of that, they've got really high kind of intrinsic value. And because they've been there for so long, they act as refuges for lots of other rare wildlife. And wild pine ultimately form a Caledonian pinewood habitat, which is the kind of special word for these wild pine populations and the habitat they form. So wild pine sites are recorded on the Caledonian Pinewood Inventory. And so this is an inventory created by Scottish Forestry. It was put together in the 1990s based on previous work in the 1950s by a couple of foresters called Stephen and Carlisle, who did a really good job documenting these sites across the Highlands. So some of these sites are very famous and you might recognize them. You know, we've got number 60 here, the Blackwood of Rannoch, a lot of people have heard of. We've got the massive pine woods of Abernethy, Rothiemurchus, Glenfeshie in Strathspey, the Mar Lodge sites in Deeside, Balfooey, Glentanner. We've got iconic places like Glen Affric up here, Glen Strathfara. We've got the pine woods of Benay and Lochmarie. But we also have lots of sites that not a lot of people have heard of, places like Loch Shiel, Callip River, Duridara, Glenfure. There's particular clusters of very small fragmented pine woods in the southwest. So I should mention that these pine woods are split into 7 biochemical zones. So that was based on work looking at some of the chemicals in the pine, which is believed to sort of show underlying genetic differences in some of these populations. So this southwest region is a region I'll kind of focus on a little bit whenever I'm talking. The Caledonian Pinewood Recovery Project was a 4-year project, a partnership between Woodland Trust and Trees for Life, and we had Nature Scot and Scottish Forestry and Forest and Land Scotland on our steering group. It involved lots of survey work, so it was plot-based survey work across 71 of the 84 Cali Pinewood sites. And this is just one of the survey forms before we went digital. It's got a bit messed up in format, but we had 1,223 of these forms carried out across these sites, and we were recording things like the different tree species present, different growth stages, different kinds of deadwood habitat, Really important herbivore impacts on those trees, stuff about the ground vegetation, about fire, about non-native species, and so on. So we basically have got quite a large data set from lots of these sites over the 4 years, and it meant we were able to say some concrete things about the state of our pinewoods. So I'm going to start off with some of the sites that are really not good. So you can see this site, which has actually been impacted by fire, which happened, I think, it's about 80 years ago. A fire came through here and killed loads of the trees. And there's basically been no tree regeneration since then. So you've still got all of these standing dead, what people call pine bones. And there's been no recovery to follow that. And that has a lot to do with herbivore impacts. So 23% of our pine woods are in this kind of critically threatened category here, where like they're either they're really just about to be lost if something's not done very urgently. And what we found was that the main pressure on pine woods is from heavy browsing by deer. So deer eating the young tree seedlings, preventing them from ever establishing. And this has been going on for a very long time in the Cali pine woods. So a lot of the trees are reaching the end of their lifespan, and they're just not going to be replaced as they die. We found that herbivore impacts were high or greater in 63% of our Cali pinewood plots. So this is it broken down by region. So you can see there's a little bit of variability. Herbivore impacts much lower in East Central region. So that's like Strathspey, the pinewoods of Glenfeshie, Rothiemurchus, Abernethy, where a lot of work has been done. But very concerningly, in the southwest, where we've got these very fragmented sites, things are a little bit worse than average. And so I've got some photos here taken along deer fences. Deer fences are the main management tool that have been used to try and restore Caledonian pinewood. The idea is that you try to keep deer out to allow that regeneration to take place. And you can see that it can work really, really well. Inside this deer fence, on this side of the picture, we've got nice mixed regeneration of Scots pine and birch. Whereas outside, each of the trees that dies is not being replaced, and slowly this pinewood's being lost and it's just turning into open hill. You find really interesting effects in some of our Cali pinewood sites with deer fences. This deer fence, inside it, over here, we've got mixed regeneration of Scots pine and birch, whereas outside, only birch has regenerated. And this is down to what we call selective overbrowsing. So basically, the deer favour eating different kinds of trees. And for some reason, we're not sure why, in the southwest region of the pine woods, the deer favour eating pine over birch. This isn't a normal, like if you go into the Cairngorms, it's the opposite. They prefer birch over pine. But for whatever reason in the southwest, they prefer pine over birch. And so what we can see here is basically a pine wood that's now transitioning into birchwood as a result of that selective overbrowsing pressure where the deer are favouring eating pine. And this is a big deal, and it's one of the reasons why our southwest pine woods are much worse than average. So 23% of our Cali pine woods are critically threatened, but it's 34% in the southwest region. The other thing that deer and heavy browsing pressure have a really big impact on is the kind of vegetation on the ground. So you can see here an effective deer fence has been up for about 30 years. And inside we've got our dwarf shrub layer is back. We've got our blaeberry, our cloudberry, and our hard fern, whereas outside we just got grasses. And if we think about what those plants are doing, these are insect pollinated berry producing plants. So they're disproportionately important for the wildlife that live in Cali pine woods. So yeah, whenever we're not seeing this in some of our pinewood sites, that's going to have massive knock-on impacts on lots of other species. And I should say this is not typical of what you see in fences. A lot of the fences haven't worked for 30 years. Deer have got inside them in the meantime. And so about 30 to 40% of our Cali pinewoods have actually been deer fenced, but it hasn't necessarily translated into proper recovery. I'll come on to that in a moment. I just want to talk a bit about the speed of regeneration inside deer fences. So we find that in the west of Scotland, so this is a fence that was put up in 1995. This is inside the fence. And you can see these little pines that were probably, up to about this kind of height after sort of 30 years almost of natural regeneration. The growth rates can be really slow in the west. But it seems that that's more like a kind of an initial problem. So if we look at this site here, basically the distance between each of these branches that translates into 1 year of Scots pine growth. And what you can see is that the growth's initially really bunched together. So the pines have grown really slowly, just very incremental year on year. But once we get up into kind of once they're above about 30 years old, they return to kind of normal growth, what you would see in the east of Scotland. So this is a really interesting effect, and it means that our deer fences were only ever designed to last sort of 20 to 30 years. It's even less now because the materials they're made from are not treated in the same way anymore. Our deer fences don't actually last long enough to get a lot of this regeneration to establish. And so, unfortunately, what I saw in a lot of places, get this to work, is this, all these dead young pines, which were inside fences where the deer had got inside and just simply started to remove the regeneration, started to kill the young trees. And that's like 20 to 30 years worth of growth in some of these pinewood sites just being lost now. So some really, really depressing stuff. It does get a bit better than this though. So yeah, you can see where it's been eaten off by the deer on the ends here. So yeah, big problems in our pine woods. And it's not just deer, we also have issues with non-native species. So here again, overall, we've got non-native species present in about 30% of our pinewood area. And this is it broken down by region. But the biggest factor that determines the non-native species is whether or not the pinewoods within the National Forest estate. So the pinewoods within the National Forest estate, managed by Forest and Land Scotland, are doing much worse for non-native species than out with those areas. And there's a reason for that, which is that a lot of the pinewoods that were used for forestry in the past, non-native species were planted through them. And so there have been, Forest and Land Scotland have put a lot of work into trying to remove these non-native species, but they're still regenerating into these areas again. And so it's another big issue. And where those species haven't yet been harvested, you end up with things like this. So we've got a big dead ancient Cali pine surrounded by Sitka spruce, and it's either been starved by light or root competition here, which has caused the death of it. And some of the sites are very threatened by that. But this is a minority thing, so this is not on the whole a major issue. Most of the non-native species are still young in Cali pine woods because it's young regeneration of them, but it will be an issue in future if we don't deal with it now. And just finally, before I hand over to Gian, this is Cali pinewood that's recovering very nicely. We saw lots of this in the Cairngorms. The key is effective landscape scale deer management, not trying to manage within fences, bringing deer down in the surrounding landscape to a level where regeneration can take place. And that's where we find brilliant recovery. We found the Caledonian pinewoods were not only replacing the trees that died, they were expanding. That means that they've got some resilience to climate change, so they can move up slope to adapt to changing conditions. And they can also be enriched by other species. So in places we also saw like some of the more palatable species coming into these areas again. So yeah, it's not all bad, but we really need this kind of phase shift from fence-based management towards landscape scale. That's what we need to do to save our pinewoods. I've got some recommendations. I'm going to fly through them because I think I'm probably running over time. We wrote a big report about this. You can find it on the Trees for Life website if you search Caledonian Pinewood Recovery Project. The recommendations of the report: we need more landscape scale deer management. We need to make fences in the west last longer that are already up because they won't last long enough for the regen to establish. We need to complete the programme of ancient woodland restoration across the National Forest estate, remove non-native tree and shrub regeneration, and expand our Caledonian pinewoods naturally. There's no reason why these pinewoods will happily seed themselves. They don't need planting to help them. And to make that happen, we need to prioritise Cali pinewood management, build stronger relationships between stakeholders, align policy and incentives with management recommendations, which is very, very important. Target resources towards the southwest region where things are most threatened, and revise and expand the Caledonian Pinewood Inventory, which is where I will hand over to Gian.
Hi there, I'm Jane, and I've been working for Trees for Life since August this year on the Wild Pine project. And as James has said, this is the successor to the Caledonian Pinewood Recovery Project. It is in partnership with Woodland Trust, and it will run for 3 years, initially focusing on the rainforest zone. The overall aims of the project are to identify, map and survey the Caledonian pinewood that has been missed on the official inventory, and we hope that the findings from the project will be used to preserve, protect and proliferate the Caledonian pinewood in future. So where are these sites? The pink dots that you can see on the aerial are our potential wild pine sites, and they are in relation to the Caledonian Pinewood Inventory that James showed earlier in the green. And the purple outline is the rainforest zone where the initial focus is. The sites aren't limited to these pink dots. As the project progresses, there may be others that we want to take a look at. So yeah, could be adding more to this map as we go. The sites were identified from the Caledonian Pinewood Recovery Project, but also from looking at first edition Ordnance Survey maps. We're looking for conifer symbols, especially those scattered in the landscape or intermixed with broadleaf woodland. And this is what a typical wild pine site looks like. This is on the east side of Loch Etive. So the trees and the associated vegetation have retreated into the gorge out of the reach of browsing and grazing. So the area is surrounded by, well, the area around is largely treeless and lacks the same diversity. And all the sites are typically small with the trees just about clinging on. So to assess whether a pine population is likely to be wild or planted, there's three main pieces of evidence that we consider. First is historical. Is there historical evidence of wild pine populations? And is there evidence of continuity with these historical populations? Ecological. Do the ecological characteristics of the site match up to those of a typical wild pine site? And if they don't, why don't they? And finally, landscape context. So given the historical, the ecological, the topographical context and of the site and of the surrounding area, does it make sense that the presence of pine is wild, or can this be explained by other things like planting or colonization from planted populations? This is a site called Cuilla Corrianoan, which is near Spain Bridge. On the left-hand side, you can see a Scots pine clinging onto a ledge, and on the right-hand side, you see one in the background just clinging onto the side of the Carr waterfall. So there are very few living pine trees on this site, but where the trees are growing give us an indication of their origin because of how restricted they are. But trees weren't always confined to these places, which is why the Wild Pine Project also looks for previous evidence of pine trees. This includes pine stumps where they occur outside of peatland. This is Glen Fionley. It's near Fort William. So I'm going to use this site just to demonstrate the evidence gathering process that the Wild Pine Project goes through. So is this pine population wild? This is a recent aerial, and the site at Glen Fionley is on the bottom left-hand side. You can see the scattered woodland, and on the top right-hand side. And going back to the first OS in the same areas, you can see that there are broadleaf and conifer symbols in the same place as the present day aerial. Back further, this is a map from the forfeited estates after the Jacobite Rebellion. So the same area, still have trees. And then back to the 1500s, this is a pont map. There isn't detail for the area. It doesn't show trees, but what the text that goes along with pont maps reveals is that there is plenty of great firwood, and this is a term used historically to refer to pinewood. So the woodland can be traced back through time using the maps and the texts. So the historical evidence for Glenfeonley as a wild pine site is really strong here. So this is part of the ecological survey. On the ground, 108 Scots pine trees were recorded, and they were mostly in the mature or senescent stage of their life, and they had variable form. Other ecological findings were a heterogeneous structure of the woodland. There were variable tree densities, variable species of trees. There were no old non-native trees on the site. There were lots of pine stumps, and the refugial species associated with ecological continuity were recorded at the site. And the ground vegetation was of semi-natural origin and typical of the Caledonian pinewoods in the surrounding area. So in the landscape context, there's several recognised Caledonian pinewoods near to this site, and no evidence was found of planting apart from the plantation forestry that you can see opposite the woodland in the glen. So with all the evidence combined for Glenfeonley, we are confident that it's a wild pine site. So what's progress and what we're going to do in future? The first half of this year, James developed a bespoke field methodology for the wild pine project, and to date 11 sites have been surveyed. On some of the sites where historical research has been tricky, we have commissioned that research externally, and we plan to and we want to present our results to site managers so that we can advise and influence future restoration, and to help build an evidence base for some of the sites. We're going to do some tree core samples and look at dendroanalysis for those, and we're also working on population genetics with the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. And our early findings, perhaps aren't surprising, is that these sites are in a critical condition. That's me.